Mr. Curtis, if you would come forward.
I would ask the court reporter to swear the witness. Mr. Curtis, would you please state your full name for the record?
Name is Clinton Eugene Curtis.
And what is your profession?
I'm a computer programmer.
Mr. Curtis, are there programs that can be used to secretly fix elections?
Yes.
How do you know that to be the case?
Because in October of 2000, I wrote a prototype for President Congressman Tom Feeney at the company I worked for in Oviedo, Florida, that did just that.
It would rig an election?
It would flip the vote 51-49 to whoever you wanted it to go to and whichever race you wanted to win.
To whoever you wanted to win. On November 2nd, 2004, George Bush was non-popular. He was in the middle of an unpopular war. I was watching the exit polls, and it looked very clear that John Kerry was going to win.
Reporting for duty.
And then all of a sudden, the numbers that were coming in did not match up with what was coming in from the exit polls, and it didn't make any sense. It just didn't make any sense. Late in the evening, 6 states that exit polls showed were going to Kerry suddenly veered off to Bush. Ohio then became the tipping point of the entire national election. One guy who was reporting on the ground in Ohio from day one was attorney Bob Fitrakis of the Columbus Free Press. Bob Fitrakis and Cliff Arnebeck became the legal team suing for a recount in Ohio, taking on Ohio's Secretary of State J. Kenneth Blackwell, who also happened to be co-chair for the Bush-Cheney campaign in Ohio.
But let me just remind you of a few of the facts. Ken Blackwell called it a model election, but we're trying to figure out, was he talking Mussolini's first coup? There were tens of thousands of acts of irregularity.
In a single precinct in Ohio, a total of 638 ballots were cast on Election Day. Bush received over 4,000 of them.
24.93% of all the voters in Cleveland were purged, a city that went 83% for Kerry. 7,000 voters lost their right to vote in the inner city of Toledo because the Diebold OptiScan machines froze up.
Warren County is the last county in Ohio to come in with their vote totals, and they locked down the place where they're counting the votes, and they won't allow any witnesses in, won't allow any media in, and they say it's because of a Homeland Security threat, and yet the next day we check with Homeland Security, and they say we never spoke to anyone in Ohio. Bob Fitrakis reported a troubling aspect about Ohio's 2004 election night results. The function of the Secretary of State's computer servers to report election results was moved during the night of the election from Ohio to servers in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They were owned by Smart Tech. Fitrakis reports that Smart Tech hosts a number of GOP websites, including the Republican National Committee and even Karl Rove's infamous White House email accounts, 4 years of which have gone completely missing.
The mythical surge in Delaware County. In one precinct, the last 359 voters voted for George Bush. And they said, well, maybe a church bus showed up. Well, not everyone lives at the same address unless you're a follower of David Koresh.
The Green Party and the Libertarian Party turned out to be huge heroes because they stepped up and said, we want to recount in Ohio.
You guys, we're presidential candidates. You can say, we want to recount. Well, you only got 7 votes in Ohio. Don't care. We want to recount.
Maybe I got 10.
That's right.
That's what I want to know.
John Kerry didn't fight.
Where was he?
Hiding out, being low-key. I mean, one of his attorneys told me, well, he wants to remain viable in 2008.
Instead of remaining viable in 2004, when he
Which
actually
he should
might
have
have won if there was an investigation.
Congressman Conyers went to Ohio to make his report on what had gone wrong in the 2004 presidential election. He's one of the most respected men in Congress. He's the Democratic leader of the Judiciary Committee. And they did a great job what happened in Ohio, simply. It was corruption on a very great scale, involving a Mr. Blackwell, Secretary of State of Ohio. And the report was very well done, very legalistic in the best sense, constitutional. I wrote a preface to it. The New York Times refused to review it. The Washington Post did not review it. The Wall Street Journal, well. And of the major papers, only the Boston Globe looked at it, and then they didn't do much about it.
If you saw that George W. Bush, in fact, did not win Ohio, and that John Kerry actually won Ohio, how would you feel about that?
I would feel sick.
Does anybody here think that John Kerry should become the president? You're in favor of George Bush being president, even if the other guy got the most votes?
I don't think he did, but yes. If that were the case, yeah.
Wow, that's not very American, sir.
But I have yet to see any proof that anything was counted incorrectly.
I initially started my blog because the corporate mainstream media, frankly, was not doing their job. I was seeing things that needed to be reported and talked about. I talked about them, and people started to take notice, including the mainstream media, Washington Post and so forth, who would link to me and report on what I was reporting, but wouldn't do it themselves, and still are not doing it themselves.
Will there be a realistic investigation of the 2004 election? Because at this point, the votes in Ohio have not been counted, not even once.
The same kind of crass effort to stop the black vote that was exposed in Florida, I know for a fact took place in Georgia and probably all across the South.
I'm in Tennessee to attend a national conference on election fraud. A man named Bernie Ellis organized the conference called Gathering to Save Our Democracy.
Clint Curtis is the whistleblower from Florida.
Yeah.
So he's going to show how you can hack into a system.
If you have no vote, you have no civil rights.
I first came in touch with Clint Curtis after I had reported on a group named Justice Through Music that was putting on a reward of $200,000 for evidence of fraud in the 2004 election. Clint was one of the folks, apparently, who had contacted them with his story, with his information, and he said, in I believe that very first email to them, that he didn't want the reward, but he wanted them to know his story.
In 2000, I was working for Yang Enterprises, which was a company in Oviedo, Florida, and their chief lobbyist, their corporate attorney, and Speaker of the House of Florida was Tom Feeney, and he was there to feed his contracts. So he came in one day, one of my first introductions to him, and he wanted us to build a vote-flipping software.
He's the Speaker of the Florida House, or about to be.
Right.
He comes into Yang, where you're working.
He came in and he wanted a vote fraud system to be built.
He wanted a vote fraud system to be built?
He wanted a program that could flip the votes without anyone seeing it. He wanted it to be able to be run on a touchscreen machine.
Okay.
In other words, hidden buttons on the screen or something like that. No keyboards, no guy in a black mask sitting across the street in a van poking things in. Just walk up and do something. And he wanted the source code to be written in such a way that the manipulation was hidden even if you saw the source code.
Is that possible?
It's not possible. If it's there and someone takes the time to look, you can't hide it. So I told him right up front that as long as you can see the source code, you can't hide it. Cannot hide it, can't be done.
And what did he say?
Well, Mrs. Yang cut me off and said...
Who's Mrs. Yang?
Mrs. Yang is the head of the company.
All right.
And she cut me off and said, we'll build it for you. Give you something to show.
Did you understand that he was asking you to do something that was illegal?
I was a Republican. I thought Tom Feeney thought the Democrats had something planned.
Okay.
And he was trying to prevent it. So I built it, delivered it the next day to her. I had a little document all written up on, how, in order to make sure that, fraud was found, what elements